Hey, YouTubers. I've stayed out of the fray as long as I possibly could have with the whole debate regarding the coronavirus and the restrictions that it's placed on our civil liberties and all of these very complex and, in a way, novel issues that are arising regarding civil liberties and constitutional law in light of the corona pandemic. And I want to touch mainly upon how the corona pandemic has affected the state of New Jersey in terms of Governor Murphy's executive order and the tensions that the Murphy administration has run into with the White House and the federal government. Um, when we realized what the pandemic was going to signify for the state of New Jersey and exactly how severe this pandemic was going to be, it was too late to prepare, but it was the time to mitigate. And I think that largely in part, the state has done as good of a job as any government entity in the country could have done. Now, the question that arises is, does this restriction on our civil liberties, and can you give me the charger, please? Thanks, Ange. Does this restriction on our civil liberties and our daily lives for the purpose of protecting the lives of that vulnerable 4 to 6% of the population constitute a legitimate exercise of constitutional power that's being wielded by the Murphy administration? Or is it, in fact, an unconstitutional restriction on your right to travel, your right to engage in commerce, and your right to basically just live your life the way that the founders had envisioned? I mean, I'm not going to argue that there are no set of circumstances that would justify or enable the state's chief executive to essentially shut things down if things got that bad and got bad enough that average day folks couldn't egress and ingress and carry on with their business. Because, of course, there are emergency powers that the state has to do so. But for the purpose of this video, my question is, and the question that I'm going to pose to you, the audience, is, has the governor's exercise of his emergency powers been unwarranted? And in this case, is it unconstitutional? I believe that it is. And my reasoning for saying that is quite simple. There is no parameters or set circumstances for where the governor is drawing the line, why the governor is drawing the line, where he is drawing it. In essence, he is choosing piecemeal to permit and exempt different categories of persons and for different reasons. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the original executive order that he signed, essential warehouse personnel, I want to use that term verbatim, essential warehouse personnel were to be exempt from the executive order and allowed on roadways to travel to and from work, etc., etc., etc. Now, that term essential warehouse personnel has evolved, or devolved for that matter, into all warehouse personnel being considered essential. So if you're a warehouse personnel for, I don't know, one of these companies, for a medical company like, say, Merck or Johnson and Johnson, that's the same as being a warehouse personnel for Barnes and Nobles, or, I don't know, Amazon Prime book fulfillment services. The point that I'm alluding to is that our governor has chosen to issue this order. He's issued it in a way that he's cutting with an axe rather than a scalpel. And I'm not entirely convinced that it's going to be enforceable if it reaches the first or last round of appeals before either the appellate division or the state Supreme Court. And now I'm sure the next question that a lot of people are pondering over or questioning is whether or not there's been a case where in one of these backwater towns in the state, which, hey, there are a lot of them, folks, local police have chosen or have attempted to charge somebody under violating the governor's executive order. And the answer to that question is yes. There's a test case right now in Mount Laurel. And it's probably going to go the appellate division. I'm thinking later rather than sooner, because this is a case that they're going to want to really touch with kid gloves. It's going to have far-ranging implications for years to come. I'm not saying that we're going to anticipate another crisis of this magnitude, or at least another crisis to the extent that this magnitude has been exaggerated. But what I am going to say is that if the appellate division or the state Supreme Court tie the hands of the state's chief executive, it's going to have a ripple effect on their ability to confront or combat crises like this. Now, the other question that I kind of let roll around my brain a little bit was, if this is such a genuine crisis and they're concerned about things like price gouging and curfews and store capacities and this other plethora of issue, then why could not the legislature have passed an emergency set of bills in the 11th hour, the same way that the U.S. Congress did to avoid the financial collapse of 2008? They could have, folks. But the issue remains is that we have a governor in this state who, for all intents and purposes, is a megalomaniac. The guy wants things done his way. And when local municipalities or county entities don't march in lockstep with his orders, the guy's known to act out. And I think a prime example of that is the ShopRite case in Garwood. In Garwood, the local mayor had adopted, not the local mayor, but the local mayor had urged the council to draft and adopt an ordinance, which she signed into law, that essentially created senior citizen shopping hours and shopping hours for vulnerable demographics in the state of New Jersey to shop so that they would not be contaminated or that they would have a lesser chance of contamination or infection. Now, was she applauded by Trenton? Did Trenton turn a blind eye? Did Trenton have a tacit approval? Hell no. The next day, the Garwood mayor got a very lovely phone call from nobody other than Murphy's esteemed Attorney General, Gerber Grewal, basically urging her. And I'm sure that the words were more strong than simply urging her or imploring her or encouraging her. He probably threw around his weight. He's a state's AG, and he probably threatened legal action. I don't know that. That's a supposition on my part. But if I had to bet all the money in my pockets, which is more than what it was, I would bet that the Attorney General called up and he said, "Hey, listen, we have state regulations that deal with crises. We can't have each of the towns, almost 600 municipalities, 565 to be exact, going about their way, creating their own rules and regulations, how they're going to address these crises. So we want you to adopt and enforce the laws as we've set them out in Trenton." And I'm going to say this right now. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second here, folks. I'm not entirely against the state riding in from the sunset or riding in from the horizon and coming into town overnight and setting those types of rules. And here's why. As I just said, we have almost 600 towns in New Jersey. What would happen, basically, if some towns say, oh no, we're going to quarantine the entire municipality? We're going to have different town hours where people can come in and out of town. People can come in and out of town for this purpose, but they can't come in and out of town for that purpose. It would be chaos. You would be seeing municipalities devolve into fiefdoms and kingdoms. And this is a scenario that I've thought long and hard about for at least the last 8 to 10 years. You're going to see a situation where each town basically tries to shut its borders, and each town attempts to enact its own rules. And they use their local police departments as basically their armies to strong arm citizenry into complying with those rules. Now, whether or not those rules or laws are constitutional is another story for another time. But this is all a consequence of living in a state where you have these multiple layers of local government. And that's a shame. That's a real shame. I mean, what I do think, and I know that I'm going to get in trouble for saying it, but it's his life, c'est la vie, is that after this crisis is over with, it's going to spur the wheels with municipal consolidation and emergency management in Trenton. Garwood, for those who are not familiar, it's a little town up in Union County. It's the second smallest town in the county. The smallest one's Winfield Park, which is basically just an abandoned army barracks that they made into its own municipality in the 1940s. But this is a real and genuine problem. Now, for those of you that have heard about Murphy's executive orders, and maybe they haven't taken the time to read them, or maybe you've read one or two of them, I'm going to shed a little bit more light onto the situation in Trenton. And I'm going to read between the lines for you. And the first thing that I'm going to say goes like this. His executive orders aren't solely about safety and avoiding contamination. His executive orders are about this: money. Money talks and bullshit walks in Trenton. Okay? And right now, as we speak, the governor has taken the liberty of signing executive orders which deal with the school year, how our teachers are going to be paid, which is a question that I've thought long and hard, how we're going to count the school year and the days in the school year. But he has to be careful when he's doing this, folks, because he doesn't want to bite off the nose to spite the face. And if he does things in a matter that's legally questionable or that's legally confrontable, he could potentially cost the state billions and billions of dollars in federal reimbursement under the FEMA Act. And that's something that I'm very sure that the governor has thought over and he's been counseled against doing. So the best way that I would personally let this ride out, and I know this is going to sound cold and callous and cruel and haphazard and reckless, I would let the wave ride out. That's it. I would let people go about their business, living their daily lives. I'd stop quarantining people. I would stop screwing with the economy. I would just totally let people live their lives. Now, that goes without saying that letting people live their lives doesn't mean that the state should turn a blind eye. But what it does mean is the state should stop this quarantine at the rate that it's causing irreparable damage to business entities and personal parties' lives, and keep doing the research towards vaccination and minimizing exposure, but weighing that against the risk that pretty soon the professional sports leagues are going to go bankrupt. Okay? Pretty soon, mom and pop businesses are going to be in a place that even if Uncle Sam comes in and throws hundreds of millions of dollars at them, they're not going to be able to get off their feet into the shape that they were in 3, 4, 5 years ago. You know? I'm going to read a little from my commenters. Green Leader, it's great to see you. I don't know what the situation is in Philadelphia, and I'm very glad that you've tuned in. I value your patronage and your support. Hiram, it's been a while, sir. I'm not sure if you realize this. You and I, we met years and years ago, Hiram. Years ago. And that's it. Glenn in Jersey. What about my health, Glenn? So far, so good. I'm eating well. I'm keeping myself very well taken care of. I'm very concerned about the precedent that this crisis is going to set for future emergencies and future natural and man-made disasters. I think that this is going to be used as a pretext for the government to suspend and erode more of our rights. I really do. But I think that the best way for that to be rectified is at the ballot boxes. Okay, November is going to be here sooner rather than later. You're going to have almost every seat in the House of Representatives up for grabs. You're going to have every seat in the state legislature up for grabs. The presidency is going to be up for grabs. Next year, the governorship is up for grabs. And these are the things that people need to do. People need to evaluate the government response to this scenario. And if they're dissatisfied or they're disheartened, write your congressman. Write him a letter saying, hey, listen, I didn't like this, this, or that. And I'm not going to blow smoke at you people. You people as individuals have much less clout in Trenton or Washington than you do when you're represented by some kind of an association or some kind of an umbrella. But it's not hard to get your legislator in Trenton's ear on some things. Hiram, we met years and years ago when I was campaigning for local office. Years ago. But I want to know, more or less, how things are being handled in other parts of the state. Cape May last week just announced they're going to ban all rentals, which is interesting because for years Cape May has tried to ban Airbnbs. They actually enacted an ordinance to do so. The state Supreme Court said, hey, listen, you can't do it. It's not constitutional. So that ordinance was null and void. And now they're the first government entity that I can think of or I can see that is using this crisis as a justification to do what they wanted to do in normal times. And it's scary. It's really scary. Well, folks, if there's nothing else, I've been on for almost 20 minutes and probably 10 minutes longer than I'd anticipated on staying on. I will be broadcasting more frequently than I have on a wide plethora of topics now that I'm not going to say I'm quarantining, but now that I'm kind of tied down. Take it easy, everybody.